Hello, DeMatha Nation. My name is Connor Glowacki, current staff member here at DeMatha, and I'm joined by fellow staff member Ben Fleury, class of 2011, and faculty members Mike Curran, class of 1999, and Scott Sicko. Thank you for joining us for today's DeMatha Zoom Hour, which features two special guests, and the first right now is Seamus Hughes, class of 2002, who is the Deputy Director of the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. Seamus is an expert on terrorism, homegrown and violent extremism, and has authored numerous reports for the program and regularly provides commentary for a bunch of media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and the Wall Street Journal, just to name a few. Seamus previously worked at the National Counterterrorism Center, serving as a lead staffer on U.S. efforts to implement a national CVE strategy countering violent extremism, and has regularly led engagements with Muslim American communities across the country, provided counsel to civic leaders after high-profile terror-related incidents, and met with families of individuals who joined terrorist organizations. Seamus has also served as senior counterterrorism advisor for the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and has authored numerous legislative bills. Seamus is a recipient of the National Security Council Outstanding Service Award and 2 NCTC Directors Awards for Outstanding Service. In addition to all of that, he teaches classes at George Washington University, as well as a homegrown terrorism and responses to homegrown terrorism class at Georgetown University as an adjunct professor. Seamus's new counterterrorism book, Homegrown: ISIS in America, has just been released, and it draws on firsthand interviews with former American Islamic State members and law enforcement officials who tracked them. And Seamus, so this book was just released. What inspired you to write about this topic in particular?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you, DeMatha, for having me. I mean, when I look back on my career, DeMatha was the formative years for me. I see Mr. Kelly's here. You know, I had a great teacher for that, and mock trial, and Mr. T, and Burke, and everybody else like that. I mean, the reason why I think I've had a little bit of success in my career is largely because of the experiences I had at DeMatha, and that speaks to both the importance of scholarship, but also being upstanding folks. I think it's important, and so thank you for that. Also, thank you for the introduction. I used to work for a senator who said, I don't need an introduction, but I sure do like it. So thank you. Why was I drawn to kind of looking at Americans who join foreign terrorist organizations? The short answer is I like a puzzle, and it didn't make sense to me why men and women would join ultra-violent organizations that behead individuals overseas in front of video cameras like this. And so I set out to solve a puzzle. And so my background is as an investigator, congressional investigator, but I work for the New York Times as a reporter too. So I roll up my sleeves and dig into things. And so I spent a good amount of time trying to figure out what makes people tick. And so I've interviewed a bunch of individuals who went to Syria and Iraq and joined ISIS and came back, and their family members. And the takeaway is there's not a rhyme or reason, right? If there's any takeaway from the book, it's that there's not a typical profile of an ISIS recruit. They're old, they're young, they're rich, they're poor, they're black, they're white, they're reverts to the faith, they're converts to the faith, they're everything in between. There's not a profile. If anyone tells you, like, here's the 10 things you need to look for a would-be terrorist, kick them out the door immediately because they don't know what they're talking about. Now, they all share the same ideology, but they come at it a bit differently. Some people are drawn to the ultra-violence. Some people just want to watch the world burn and join a foreign terrorist organization. And ISIS won't recruit that. But other people, surprisingly so, what I found was we're drawn to this so-called positive narrative, right? So seeing the idea of building a so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, giving out candy to kids in Raqqa or electricity in Mosul, right? The idea of building something bigger and better than themselves was a driver for a lot of Americans. It's very counterintuitive when you look at the violence, but in many ways, this idea of societal building was a driver. Sorry, that was a long-winded way of saying I find people interesting.
No, great. Thank you, Seamus, and thank you for joining us today. So you're currently the Deputy Director of the Program of Extremism at GW University. Now, I know you wear many different hats in your professional career, but what exactly does that mean, and what kind of does a normal day in the life of Seamus Hughes look like?
So a normal day in the life of Seamus Hughes has 3 kids running on top of me while I'm trying to do a Zoom, or a normal COVID day, right? So the program on extremism we launched it 5.5 years ago. And the idea was there was a whole bunch of research centers and think tanks around the world that looked at extremism internationally, but very few that looked inward in the US. And the ones that did so in kind of a very abrasive or alarmist way. And so we wanted to just the facts, man. What does the threat look like? How do we talk about it? And how do we explain it to policymakers and the public in a way that, again, isn't saying that people are trying to hide under your bed, trying to kill you, but also doesn't ignore the fact that 1,000 active investigations are happening in the FBI at the same time. So I've got a team of 9 paid colleagues right now, another 20 to 30 non-resident fellows, and 10 interns, all working virtually. And so we've got a bunch of streams of things. We look through court records. We track every Tom, Dick, and Harry who's ever been arrested for terrorism charges in the US, go through about 20,000 pages of legal documents. We've got a partnership with the New York Times to translate and put out about 15,000 pages of internal ISIS documents that they recovered in Mosul in Iraq. So we're going through that and doing analysis there. We do a good amount of monitoring of social media platforms. And that's, I should say, not limited to just ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We also look at far-right extremists, white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, Boogaloo, anyone with a quirky extremist ideology. That's usually up our alley. And so, yeah, that's generally the gist of it. Take the ivory tower 20,000 page document and make it accessible for a 1-pager for a policymaker. So, things that when I was in government, my bosses used to glaze over whenever I gave them a memo that was anything more than 3 pages. So we try to make it academically sound, but still relevant to the now and then.
Seamus, you were kind enough to come back to DeMatha last summer when I led a professional development on 9/11. So I appreciate your kindness there. So welcome back again virtually this time. Before we started the recording, we're talking a little bit about Europe and obviously their proximity to Islamist hotspots is much closer than ours. But in the light of the recent attacks in France and Austria these last few months, could you talk a little bit about the different threats that the U.S. faces as opposed to the ones in Europe?
Yeah, we're largely in a better place in the U.S. than Europe. That's not to say Europe's in a bad place, but when you look at the numbers, just the pure numbers, we've got something like 300 people traveled or attempted to travel to go join ISIS from America. To put that in contrast, 5,000 people traveled from Europe and successfully got to Syria and Iraq. So you're talking about orders of magnitude in terms of numbers of cases. In the US, radicalization and recruitment for groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda tends to occur largely online. So if you're a kid in Indiana thinking about how great ISIS is, you're probably not going to find anybody else in Indiana who agrees with you down the street, right? Whereas if you were in Birmingham, UK in 2015, there were folks handing out leaflets about how great the caliphate was, right? There was a group called Astria for UK, which was kind of laying the groundwork for this. And so there was in-person networks that mattered a great deal. And so you're seeing those networks still happening right now in Europe, especially in response to the publication of the Prophet Muhammad's cartoon in France, but a larger crackdown in general about this. And so it's just a different dynamic. In the US too, the FBI tended to interject themselves earlier in the process. So the FBI could insert an informant into the conversation early. And so that means that instead of having a cell of 12 people talking about how great ISIS is, the FBI would take that cell down when it got to 2 people, right? Whereas in the UK, France, Germany, those tools weren't necessarily in the toolbox. Right? It's illegal to join ISIS in the US. It was not illegal to do so in the UK 4 or 5 years ago, or at least go to Syria and Iraq. And so less tools available, also lesser sentences. Our folks tend to get 20 years in jail for terrorism-related crimes. In Europe, you've got anything between 2 to 5 years is the typical sentence. So larger problem set, less tools in this toolbox, and then a general undercurrent of kind of extremist beliefs in a way that you don't see in the U.S. There's not with some notable exceptions, you're not going to walk into a mosque in the U.S. and hear someone rail about how great ISIS is, right? That is an outlier if it happens. It was not necessarily an outlier in some places in Europe at the time.
Seamus, it's really awesome that you're here. I'm obviously, before we started recording, I was geeking out about the book and all the kind of the cool information that you were sharing with us. But one thing that I was thinking as you were talking about the different levels of radicalization when it comes to Europe and the United States, teaching a class on terrorism and extremism, I do look into, and I have the kids look into, de-radicalization programs that are present in Europe. I didn't know if we actually had any like organized de-radicalization programs that we have here in the United States, similar to Europe, or if we've taken any steps in that direction to kind of implement de-radicalization in areas we might think be possibly hotspots where we can kind of get ahead of the curve a little bit more.
That's a phenomenal question. And let me geek out even more. If you don't mind, I'll start with a story, right? So I interviewed a guy from the Northeast, and his name was Mo. And so me and Mo hung out for a couple of days talking about his life. And Mo was a student at a prestigious Ivy League university, and he was really liking ISIS. And so he was looking online for ISIS content, and the FBI knocked on his door and said, "Hey, Mo, we think you're thinking about joining ISIS. Like, what's going on?" And our guy Mo says, "Absolutely not joining ISIS, not going to happen." Of course, 3 days later, he gets on a plane and goes to join ISIS, right? So he gets over to Turkey, and he lights up his Twitter profile and reaches out to an ISIS recruiter online. And the ISIS recruiter says, "You're in this hotel in Turkey. Go down in the lobby in a few hours. Someone will pick you up. When they pick you up, we'll talk after that." So our guy Mo, this guy from the Northwest in America, comes down to the lobby in Turkey, gets picked up in a car, driven to the Turkish border, crosses over to Syria, and gets picked up by another set of cars, right? When he's there, he spends about 3 weeks in religious indoctrination or ISIS ideology indoctrination. And then he spends another 3 weeks in weapons training. At each point in the time, he's filling out a spreadsheet. He goes into a room just like the ones we're in now. There's a guy on the computer, and they ask him his name, his date of birth, his next of kin, things like that. It's a very bureaucratic way of joining a terrorist organization. I promise there's a point to the circle story, right? Also, I just think you should know how to join a terrorist organization so you don't have to. So we've already done that. No one at DeMatha needs to go travel. We figured this out, right? So our guy Mo does his 3 weeks in weapons training, gets assigned, he's not a particularly good ISIS member, so he gets assigned changing oil for the Islamic State. So he's got the Emir of cars, the Emir of logistics he works for, which is not a glamorous job if you're an Ivy League kid, trying to make it in the caliphate, right? After a few weeks, he realizes it's not for him, and he wants to come home. So darned if he doesn't, reach out to the FBI agent who interviewed him in New York and says, "Hey, it's me, Mo. You may not remember me, but like you asked me if I joined ISIS. Turns out I'm in ISIS right now. I'd like to come home. Send me a helo and give me full exoneration." And the FBI agent had to go through a series of bureaucratic things to respond to an ISIS member on email, and emails back and says, "No, but if you get yourself to an embassy, we can work something out." And so Mo tries 2 or 3 times, and then finally gets smuggled through a trunk of a taxi car back to Turkey, and then turns himself into an embassy, a U.S. embassy there. Here's the point. Once he turns himself in, he flips. He gets charged with material support to terrorism, which is a pretty large statute in the federal code. He's facing 20 years. The FBI and the U.S. attorney say, "You're going to spend some time in jail, but you seem to have some remorse. And so what I'm going to have you do is knock on the door of minors of cases in New York that we're worried about. So kids under the age of 18 who are liking ISIS, who the FBI doesn't want to arrest them and jam them up from 20 years in jail. And you're going to say, knock it off." And so Mo would knock on the door and say, "Hi, my name is Mo. You may not know me, but I joined the Islamic State. I think you're going to join it too. I think that's a dumb idea. And here's what I witnessed," right? And so this is all to say de-radicalization programs in the US tend to be very broad-based, like an engagement with 300 people in a room. And I don't find them particularly effective. The ones I find effective are the one-on-one interventions, right? It's for lack of a better word, the big brother, big sister of de-radicalization, right? You want to get a sense of you want to have a personal relationship and build some sort of mentorship to pull yourself out. You got to remember, most of these guys spend 18 hours a day just listening online to how great ISIS is, and no one else has told them it's not. And so if you can just switch off a circuit breaker every once in a while, you get some good things that come out of it.
Well, we still got some time to ask him more questions, Seamus, and to open up the floor to the audience here. So if anybody wants to ask Seamus a question, please use the Zoom chat bar on the side. Include your name, and if you're an alum, include your year you graduated. That'd be a big help for us relaying the questions to Seamus. Until we get one of these audience questions, Seamus, you're obviously, you receive a lot of awards, a lot of recognition in your career. Let's rewind back to DeMatha. You graduated in 2002. Was there a certain faculty member or teacher that inspired you to lead you on the career path that you are on today?
Man, you're gonna put everyone on point here. I mean, I've got some of my teachers on this call. Like I said, Mr. Kelly was influential for me for government politics and mock trial. Mr. T, I thought I was going to start my career doing politics, and so I was very excited about his class. And then once I got into politics after graduating from college, I decided I hated politics, but not because of him. So he was absolutely an influence for me. The whole experience too. I mean, listen, I was, I grew up with a single mom. Like, the need to have a kind of a brotherhood and a sense of belonging in that way, I think was very influential for me. Just to have a lot of male role models in my life, and so I really enjoyed that. I'm really happy you didn't throw on the prom king kind of picture or anything like that right now. None of those things. I was kind of a nerd with the occasional sport here and there.
Great, Seamus. So question from Tim Kelly. He says, question from one of your old history teachers at DeMatha. What lessons learned from the research and writing of your book, ISIS, Homegrown in America, might be applied to other forms of domestic extremism? And is there a profile for extremism that extends beyond any single group?
Sure. I think I said there was no profile, and then I'll add a little caveat. The hotheads tend to be younger. So the people that commit violence tend to be you don't usually make a rational decision when you're 19 or 20, whether that be, drinking or jihadism. So that's a profile. I think the lesson to be learned between, let's say, ISIS recruitment and neo-Nazi recruitment or white supremacy recruitment right now, or even militia recruitment, is that social media companies haven't caught up yet. So it was very easy in 2015 to find an ISIS recruiter on Twitter. It is nearly impossible to do so now on Twitter, right? Because they've systematically taken down content. They've got content moderators. It is not particularly hard for me to join a white supremacist movement in Georgia in about 5 minutes if I wanted to on Twitter, because the content moderation by the mainstream sites hasn't caught up. Now, some of that's not their fault. It's easy to figure out that a beheading video should go down. It's a little bit harder when the guy's just railing against restrictions and wearing masks in public spaces, right? Whereas the undercut is actually, he's been a Klans member for the last 20 years, and so that he's just using this as a front, right? But that level of nuance gets lost sometimes when you're doing content moderation. So I think they're going to have to train up on that. The other difference between the two is in ISIS and Al-Qaeda kind of recruitment, it would be very unusual to see 12 guys training for a paint gun competition for ISIS without the FBI having 6 of them be the informants, right? It is easier when you come to kind of militia groups. So the governor of Michigan was a victim of a threat, a plot 2 weeks ago by 13 men. I think one was an informant, but it's really hard to get a crew of folks that the ISIS supporters in the real world for that in the U.S.
So, and Seamus, just following up on some of this information, I teach, like I said, a class here at DeMatha, the history of terrorism, extremism, and I'm always kind of curious. I'm always wrestling with the idea of, well, what should I have kids making sure that they walk out of my room understanding? You know, in terms of terrorism, extremism, there are so many different directions you can go in because of regional differences, geographic differences, ideological differences. I try to tie some overarching themes together that I think they should be able to walk out of the room with. But in your professional opinion, if you were to be able to provide this to me, this would be really helpful in terms of what message should, you know, younger individuals and probably adults too, who don't really understand terrorism fully, take away from kind of either our conversation or my class that I teach here at DeMatha.
Sure. Let's take the two audiences in two different ways. So for parents, I would talk about the need to be involved in your kid's life, especially when it comes to the online environment. And that's not just, I'm not saying your kid's getting recruited for ISIS, but you know, I think there's a conversation to be had about parental, the need to look at platforms our kids use, whether it be TikTok or anything else, right? It's just a whole world of extremism and also just sadness that we should address, right? In a brighter note for the kids, for the students, is don't just because I wrote a book 250 pages on terrorism does not mean that I see everything as terrorism or extremism. It's a relatively small phenomenon. You're not talking about a mass movement of any real substance, particularly in the U.S. You're talking about 1s and 2s, 3s and 4s, not 5s and 6s, 7s and 8s. And so I would just make sure that everyone puts that in context. But particularly when you look at violent extremism, people that commit violence, numbers are very, very small. Extremism a little bit larger, but still relatively small to the general population. So we shouldn't scare so easily, and we shouldn't have policies that scare so easily. And so you never want to overreact in a way that may then feed into a narrative.
James got a question from Brian Murphy, class of 2003, and I'm interested in this question as well. How have you been able to keep your sense of humor despite being so close to such an intense and frankly scary world and scary topic every day?
Irish wit and drinking, I think, is the two things together. I think, well, no, listen, I take breaks. I purposely take breaks on stuff. So I'll give you an example. I had to look at, there was an ISIS propaganda video of a man beheading a Kurdish prisoner, right? And I got a tip from a law enforcement source that was an American. So I had to repeatedly watch the video because I needed to connect both his voice pattern to what I had recorded of his high school video, and also kind of his hands to make a confirmation that was that person, right? I took probably 20 walks that day. You don't need to spend 8 hours looking at terrorist propaganda. So it's important to take breaks. When I get home, I try my best from 5 to 7 to throw my phone in a fishbowl and never look at it, and just be in the moment with the kids. I think that's important. I also try, listen, sometimes it's just fun because these guys are idiots too. Terrorism doesn't attract the well-adjusted, nor does it attract the particularly smart. And so if you can get the kind of quirky, fun things that are in the court records about some guy who wanted to commit an attack on a Jewish holiday against a synagogue, but damned if he didn't get the Jewish holiday dates wrong because he was looking at an old calendar from last year. And you just have to remind yourself that sometimes this is mildly funny. Also put it in context, people may die. So you balance it too.
Seamus, I'm going to go out on a limb here and be a little bit timely, so I hope you don't mind speaking about it. But Democrats have been critical of the Trump administration for denying Biden access to the Daily Brief and the security things. I was just wondering if that continues for a month or 6 weeks until the election is sort of sorted, at least on President Trump's end. Is that a big problem, or is the National Security Council and other agencies and civil servants sort of self-contained and they're just continuing doing their work, and that President-elect Biden could jump in later with not much of a problem during the transition?
Sure. I make a joke sometimes that I talk enough about religion. I try not to touch on politics, but let's go ahead. The short answer is it's not great that the president-elect doesn't have the daily PDD brief. So to not get the intelligence to know what you're going on, particularly when you talk about, he's doing phone calls with foreign leaders, and it's helpful for the State Department to give him a heads up of what that foreign leader's actual goal is before that phone call happens, or whether there's a threat against our interests in China, and maybe when you talk to the Chinese premier, you should do something else, right? So the short answer is it would be great if he got those presidential briefings. The longer answer is Biden's been in the game for 30 years. You generally have a sense of what's going on in the world when you've been in politics that long, and he's surrounded by a whole lot of smart men and women who will be able to kind of feed him into the world. I worry less about the bureaucratic nature of this. When I was in government at the intelligence community, nobody asked me if I was a Republican or Democrat, and I didn't know if they were either. You kind of we were always taught that politics stopped at the water's edge when it came to national security. And I hope that at least the vast majority of folks still believe that. In fact, I know the vast majority of folks still believe that. Most people just keep their head down and hope for the best. Now, it's not what you ideally want in the world, but it is what it is. We're adaptable people.
Thanks, Seamus. Next question for me, actually. So just kind of curious what led you or sparked your interest on topics such as terrorism and violent extremism. Where did this passion for these topics come from?
I completely fell into it. It makes no sense. So I was at the U.S. Senate. I was a congressional staffer there, and it was 2006, I guess. And the staffer doing homegrown terrorism got a new job. Like he became a lobbyist or something. I don't remember. And the staff director looked at me and said, the average age of a terrorist recruit is 22, and you're 22, and there's only about 10 cases a year. So you just take this niche thing and monitor it a little bit for the senator, but you can't mess it up. There's not a big deal, right? And so unfortunately then Fort Hood terrorist attack happened, a number of different things. And basically my interest in homegrown terrorism unfortunately grew as the threat grew. So when 24 people left from Minneapolis to go join a terrorist organization in Somalia, I was, flying out and meeting with family members of kids who did that. I just simply fell into it. I really wish I wasn't relevant. I mean, I would love to, like I said, to teach history of terrorism and not the current politics of terrorism. And that's the end goal, is to make myself irrelevant.
Seamus, do you have a favorite? We're gonna go back to DeMatha and rewind a little bit here. Do you have a favorite memory from your 4 years at DeMatha?
God,
A general question.
favorite memory. I don't know. I mean, listen, I really just like I liked when we were doing football and basketball games, and the crowd would go crazy against Gonzaga, and the refs would tell us we can't chant that because that was offensive or something like that, right? I mean, those kind of moments when you had a bunch of people all hanging out, and you had this sense of man, you're bigger, you're part of something bigger than yourself. I think actually that's probably why people join terrorist organizations too. But let's feed them towards DeMatha, not ISIS. And so, yeah, I think those type of experiences were very formative.
Go ahead, Scott. Sorry if you have another question. Say go.
Yep. No worries. So Seamus, just talking, I'm sorry, I'm taking this back to the terrorism topic away from DeMatha, but right now I know in the United States, you said you're looking into more right-wing extremism, right-wing terrorism groups. The FBI recently came out not too long ago and basically highlighted them as probably the most realistic threat that we could face in terms of actually terrorism on our shores. Why do you think there's been, right-wing terrorism has always been around in America, but why do you think we've seen an increase in recent years? Why is it becoming more of a concern publicly with that being an actual threat, tangible threat that we have to address?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different factors. Probably chief among them is the internet and polarization. So we as a society tend to be more polarized, and polarization will feed into extremism. You know, when you don't see the other side of having any human value, it makes you very easy to move on to violence. The other thing I think is the internet. You know, the ability to recruit people with relative ease right now, without mainstream sites like YouTube or Google or anywhere else taking anything down, makes your life a lot easier right now. And then let's be honest. I mean, just the rhetoric that we have in politics allows for some level of coverage of this issue, and so it doesn't help when you're not getting denounced on a regular basis by our political leaders.
Hey, Seamus. So last question for you here from Jim Key, class of 1993. He asked, do you think the first-person shooter gaming world has had an effect on creating these bad guys?
That's the great debate. That's one of the great debates in terrorism studies is like, you know, how important is this idea of gamification for recruitment and radicalization? The short answer is, given the proliferation of first shooter games and terrorism not going the same route, it's probably not a causation, maybe a correlation. I think it's probably more interesting to look at how ISIS has taken that approach. So their videos that they put out, their propaganda videos, are as slick and well produced and interactive as a video game. And so it's basically a choose your own adventure in a little bit way. So they're learning marketing from you know, gaming platforms like that, and making it a little bit better than it used to be. So I don't know if you guys remember. I hope you don't. Like Bin Laden, Osama bin Laden's old videos, you know, he'd be standing behind a whiteboard like this. He would get a 0 out of 0 on room rate, right? And he would talk about how great Al Qaeda is for 45 minutes. I would fast forward through it, and I studied terrorism for a while in my career, right? So it's not interactive. Whereas in ISIS world, you would have a Twitter DM back and forth with a guy in Raqqa who would systematically give you pictures of the coolest thing that they just put out, or the beheading video they had, or the gun he's holding, or how great it is in Raqqa. And so there's an interactivity I think we can't discount for groups like ISIS, and I think they learned that a lot from where marketing went.
Seamus, thanks for taking the time to join us on the Zoom call and answer some questions about your fascinating career that you have going on. We really appreciate it and hope you and your family continue to stay safe during the pandemic out here.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for everybody for coming on. Before you go, I want to toss to Ben real quick, just for a quick message from the advancement office here at DeMatha.
Yeah. Thank you, Seamus. We really appreciate you. That's some fascinating stuff. So that was awesome. Just kind of, you know, as we conclude, we'd just like to ask you, obviously, for your support for the fund for the DeMatha that went in the mail in October. Obviously, I'm an advancement guy, so this is, you know, I got to do this. So it's critical to the school and support of our ongoing mission of faith-filled gentlemen and scholars. You can always give online at www.dematha.org or by mail. So thank you, everyone, for your great questions and for joining us today.